Hello, this is a video for the 5.12 lesson, Transition. On July 4th, 1976, Americans celebrated their nation's 200th birthday. It was also an election year, and in November, Americans went to the polls to elect their next president. The Republican candidate was Gerald Ford, the man who had assumed the presidency upon Nixon's resignation. The Democratic nominee was a former state legislator and one-term governor of Georgia, Jimmy Carter. With an economy still suffering from the Arab oil embargo and an American public that had lost his faith in the established politicians, Carter provided an appealing alternative and won the election. His presidency would be marked by successes in foreign affairs and a crisis involving American hostages in Iran. Goals for this lesson: identify Gerald Ford and the way in which he became president, explain key elements of the economic crisis of the 1970s, and describe Carter's foreign policy achievements and challenges. Okay, when you go to lesson resources, find your lesson answer key and or reading guide, and let's begin with today's reading, starting on page 883. Okay, so here we are, a Ford, not a Lincoln. In 1973, among the scandals plaguing Nixon's second term, one involved his vice president, Spiro T. Agnew, who resigned in disgrace after revelations that he accepted bribes while serving as a governor of Maryland. To replace Agnew, Nixon chose Congressman Gerald R. Ford of Michigan, the long-serving Republican leader of the House of Representatives. When the Watergate revelations led Nixon to resign, Ford became president, the first president to serve as both president and the first person to serve as both vice president and president without being elected. Gerald Ford, Jerry to his friends, was very different from his predecessor. He had been an All-American football player at the University of Michigan and was even drafted by 2 NFL teams. He chose instead to attend law school. After service in World War II, Ford won election to Congress and rose steadily in the GOP ranks. Ford was widely respected for his honesty, modesty, and his ability to get along with his opponents. Declaring, "I'm a Ford, not a Lincoln," he offered a refreshing contrast to Nixon. In his first full day as president, Ford had not yet moved into the White House, but still lived at his home in a Virginia suburb. There at about 6:40 a.m., members of the press snapped photographs of the chief executive emerging on his doorstep, dressed in blue pajamas, retrieving his morning newspaper. A few observers thought the scene undignified, but most Americans appreciated a president who, as the Washington Post described him, seemed like the most normal, sane, down-to-earth individual to work in the Oval Office since Harry Truman left. But much of the goodwill dissolved only a few weeks into Ford's term. Ford pardons Nixon. From the first, the new president found himself overwhelmed by inquiries about a possible prosecution of Nixon. Ford believed it would tear the country apart to see a former president to stand trial for high crimes. So on September 8, 1974, sincerely wishing to put Watergate in the past, he used his presidential authority to pardon Nixon for any crimes he may have committed in office. In a televised address, he proclaimed, "Now therefore I, Gerald R. Ford, President of the United States, do grant a full, free, and absolute pardon unto Richard Nixon for all offenses against the United States which he has committed or may have committed." The pardon provoked immediate and widespread criticism. Many suspected Ford had issued the pardon to Nixon in exchange for the chance to become president. Ford and Nixon flatly denied the charge, and no evidence has ever supported it. Others believed that if Ford's motives were sincere, he had just put Nixon above the rule of law, an action that did little to restore the confidence of citizens in the government. 2 months after the pardon, voters punished the Republicans in the 1974 off-year elections, giving a sweeping victory to Democratic candidates across the country. And there's just a picture of Ford's speech that he gave where he pardoned Nixon. And before we go on, let's read the 25th Amendment excerpt. The U.S. Constitution states that should the president be removed from office, die, or be unable to discharge his duties, those duties fall to the vice president. No president has ever been removed from office, but 8 have died in office, 4 from natural causes and 4 by assassination. In each case, the vice president became president. But when the Constitution was written in 1787, it makes no provision for replacing a vice president. Nor does it specify what to do when a president is unable or unfit to carry out his duties. Those gaps were filled by the 25th Amendment ratified in 1967. The amendment provides for appointing a new vice president to replace one who dies, resigns, or takes over the presidency in case of the death or resignation of the president. The amendment also provides a clear procedure for the transfer of power when a president is unable to discharge the powers and duties of his office. In 1973, Vice President Spiro Agnew, after vehemently denying charges of bribery and other wrongdoings while he was governor of Maryland, agreed to plead no contest to a single count of failing to pay income tax. He resigned from office, and under the new constitutional process, Nixon nominated Gerald Ford as vice president. When Nixon resigned, Ford succeeded to the presidency and nominated as vice president New York Governor Nelson Rockefeller, who took office after being confirmed by a majority vote in the House and Senate. For the first time in history, neither the president nor the vice president of the United States had been elected to their offices. And continuing on, stagflation. Okay, but before I read about stagflation, let's write about finality in Vietnam. In 1975, Gerald Ford was in the White House when South Vietnam fell to the Communists. When the North Vietnamese unleashed an assault aimed at unifying the country under Communist rule, Ford asked Congress for an emergency appropriation of $722 million to supply South Vietnam's army with tanks and rifles, but Congress refused. Republican Senator Jacob Javits of New York spoke for many of his colleagues when he told Ford, "I will give you large sums for evacuation, but not one nickel for military aid." North Vietnamese troops took control of Saigon, the South Vietnamese capital, on April 30, 1975. Helicopter crews scrambled to evacuate desperate American military and civilian personnel from the city, while thousands of South Vietnamese clamored to enter the American embassy in search of asylum. It was a discouraging end to a long and bloody conflict. Stagflation. As president, Ford inherited an economy suffering from inflation due to the Arab oil embargo in the wake of the 1973 Arab-Israeli War. When the oil-producing Arab states cut the supply to crude oil, it was not only oil prices that shot up. Because oil is necessary for the production and transportation of everything from food to durable goods, prices on nearly everything rose sharply. Inflation usually occurs in times of economic growth and high employment, but in the 1970s witnessed the new and troubling combination of rising prices and declining employment. Economists call the phenomenon stagflation, a mix of stagnation and inflation. Rising unemployment was due in part to many baby boomers coming of age and joining the workforce. There were too many of them and too few jobs to go around. Women were also seeking jobs in greater numbers. While more people were seeking jobs, U.S. factories were cutting or moving jobs in response to new competition from developing nations where wages were much lower. Corporations began to shift jobs from the United States to overseas, crippling industrial cities such as Detroit, home to the automobile industry, and Youngstown, Ohio, where steel factories suffered. In May 1975, the unemployment rate reached 9%. Ford's Treasury Secretary warned the president that if we can't finally control inflation, we won't have an economy left to argue about. Ford responded with a program called Whip Inflation Now, with the acronym WIN. The title was urgent, but the plan's scope was limited. Americans were encouraged to help by limiting their purchases, a recommendation that threatened to slow the economy further. The administration issued win buttons to raise awareness and morale, but prices and unemployment continued to rise. The election of 1976. Ford's presidency was not without significant accomplishments. He helped restore integrity to the office. He advanced Nixon's policy of détente by signing the 1975 Helsinki Accords, which brought 35 communist and non-communist nations together on principles of national self-determination and peaceful resolution of conflicts. But Ford faced large obstacles in his bid to win the 1976 presidential election. Many disapproved of his party of Nixon. The Republican Party still carried the taint of Watergate. Stagflation had thrown many families into economic crisis. Though the fall of Saigon had not been Ford's fault, the spectacle was associated with him in many people's minds. In the Republican primaries, Ford was challenged by Ronald Reagan, a former movie star who had become a popular governor of California. Reagan appealed to conservatives who believed that both Nixon and Ford had too often given into the demands of liberals in Congress. Ford narrowly edged Reagan to win the Republican nomination, but he went into the general election in the head of a divided party. The Democrats nominated a true outsider for president, Jimmy Carter, a former state legislator and one-term governor of Georgia. Raised on a peanut farm in rural Plains, Georgia, and educated at the U.S. Naval Academy in Annapolis, Carter belonged to a rising generation of moderate Southern Democrats, dubbed New Democrats by the press. A Southern Baptist, Carter was open about his beliefs as an evangelical Christian. When he first decided to run for president, his candidacy seemed implausible. When he told his mother, she asked, "President of what?" But in the wake of Vietnam and Watergate, when many Americans had lost faith in the established politicians, Carter provided an appealing alternative. I'm Jimmy Carter, and I'm running for president. I will never lie to you. Carter repeated time and again to broad approval. The election was close, but Carter prevailed, with strong support from African American voters in the South. Now, the peanut farmer from the little town of Plains, as Carter often liked to describe himself, would try to restore stability and respect to the nation's highest office. The Carter presidency. From the beginning, Carter tried to establish an informal, accessible tone. Instead of donning formal wear for his inaugural ceremony, he wore an everyday business suit. After the ceremony, rather than ride in the limousine, he and his family walked down Pennsylvania Avenue to the White House. And here's a picture of that. In an early televised address to the nation, he wore a cardigan sweater. In these and other ways, Carter tried to convey the image of a president of and for the people. Government cannot solve our problems. As a moderate Democrat, Carter quickly found himself at odds with much of the agenda set by liberals in his own party, such as proposed new spending for anti-poverty and health initiatives. As president, Carter wanted to restrain government spending and deregulate business and industry, goals usually associated with conservatives and Republicans. Government cannot solve our problems, he told Congress. It cannot eliminate poverty or provide a bountiful country or reduce inflation or save our cities or cure illiteracy or provide energy. To many of his fellow Democrats, these words were hard to swallow. Senator George McGovern of South Dakota remarked, "It sometimes seems difficult to remember who won last fall." Carter in Foreign Affairs. In international affairs, Carter tallied an impressive list of accomplishments. He passionately believed that a concern for human rights, not just national interests, should govern U.S. actions abroad. For example, he spoke out strongly against apartheid, the policy of strict racial segregation then enforced in South Africa. He signed a treaty to return sovereignty over the Panama Canal to Panama by the end of 1999. This measure helped ease tension between the United States and its Central American neighbors, who had long been bitter about American control of the Canal Zone. In September 1978, Carter tried to bring peace to the troubled Middle East by convening a summit at Camp David, the presidential retreat in Maryland. He brought together Israeli Prime Minister Menachem Begin and Egyptian President Anwar Sadat for 12 days of negotiations. Since the 1973 Yom Kippur War, Israel and Egypt had existed in a state of tense truce. Carter engaged both countries' leaders in long rounds of talks that resulted in a historic set of agreements known as the Camp David Accords. Under these accords, Egypt established diplomatic ties with Israel and became the first Arab state to recognize Israel's right to exist. In return, Israel agreed to give up parts of the Sinai Peninsula, which it had captured from Egypt in the Six-Day War of 1967. The Camp David Accords also called for a peace treaty between Israel and Egypt. The following year, Sadat and Begin traveled to Washington, D.C. They signed the peace treaty at the White House. Millions watched televised reports of the ceremony and were filled with hope when the two old enemies embraced. Here's a picture of that. But peace in the Middle East remained elusive. No other Arab countries agreed to join the Camp David Accords. Sadat's peace treaty with Israel infuriated many Arabs. In October 1981, Sadat was assassinated by militant Islamic fundamentalists. As the 20th century moved to its final decades, the Middle East continued to be a troubled region. The energy crisis. For many Americans at the time, Carter's foreign policy accomplishments were overshadowed by troubles at home, including continuing stagflation made worse by a crisis in energy. OPEC, the international oil cartel based in the Middle East, doubled oil prices, thus raising an inflation rate that was already crippling the American economy. People waited for hours at long lines in gas stations. High gas prices led to high food prices, high clothing prices, high housing prices, high everything prices. In response, banks raised their interest rates, which made it difficult for Americans to purchase cars and houses, further contributing to the existing crisis of unemployment. In 1977, Carter proposed a national energy plan, which created a federal Department of Energy, outlined conservation measures, and targeted funds to develop new sources of energy. Carter appealed to the American people to turn down their thermostats, trade in their gas guzzlers for more energy-efficient cars, consume less, and save more. Critics responded that the president needed to offer less advice and more practical solutions. We'll end this video here and start up the next video with the Iran hostage crisis.